Oh, hello again. Welcome to Denton's Tales. Now, I've always had a great interest in ships. Well, there's one there. And I've been to sea quite a number of times. I've even gone through a storm, a very strong gale, where the bow of the ship was rising high into the air and then crashing back down, sending water pouring back over the forward well deck. And the passengers, well, they were being sick all around me. Everywhere I looked, people were hanging over the rails or just lying on the deck looking like landed fish, while I was strutting around feeling very nautically superior. Arr, they just be landlubbers, they be. Ain't got no sea legs. Arr, because you see, I was never sick at sea. I visited quite a few famous ships, like Lord Nelson's HMS Victory. And back in 1912, my mother, 3 years old at the time, was actually carried on stage in the Empire Theatre in Southampton, playing the part of a baby, typecasting obviously, in a benefit performance for the surviving crew of the Titanic. So shipping has always interested me. And while preparing the second part of my Two Faiths Intertwined video, having as it does biblical connections, which I'll be posting shortly, I got to thinking about the very first ship, mentioned as it is in the Bible, and I'm going to pop this video in as a sort of stopgap in between the two parts of the Intertwined Faith ones. I hope you find it interesting. So I would like to talk about that first ship that ever existed. Well, so we are told, despite the actual scientific impossibility of that. Of course, biblical stories, now biblical stories have to be seen in the light of where and when they were written. Much of the Bible was never intended to be taken literally. The people of those times, they loved to use parables and allegories, even riddles. They would almost encode messages into things that in their time would have been easily understood, but seen today as actual literal facts of something that happened, they don't always carry the message that they were intended to impart, or even make sense in some cases. But to the ship, well, actually, come to think of it, it wasn't really a ship as such, so I won't say she, I'll call it it, since it had no bow or stern, no mast, no rudder, no means of propulsion. It couldn't be steered, and it simply went where the ocean took it. It was really a floating rectangular box, you could say, a barge perhaps, because all it really had to do was float and just hope that it went wherever a good place was to go. The trouble is that floating was something it couldn't really have done, at least not for very long. And there are other inconsistencies about the ARK as well. Yes, I am talking about the ARK. Now, we know that floods occurred in various places over the centuries. That's quite easy to see. And it's very likely that people, seeing the water rising, would have piled as much of their belongings and animals as they could into a boat, if they were lucky enough to have one handy, and then sailed to higher ground. That would obviously have made perfect sense. Those local floods became part of mythology in most of the lands of the Middle East and elsewhere, in fact. But, a several-mile deep worldwide flood that submerged even the tallest mountains, with a big wooden box thing full of two of every creature on Earth floating around on it, well, that's really pure fiction. Well, it's a nice story to be true, but nothing more than that, an allegorical story perhaps. Why? Well, firstly, simple naval architecture comes into it quite considerably. According to the Bible, the ark was 300 cubits in length. Its breadth was 50 cubits and its height 30 cubits. That's Genesis 6:15. But there is debate as to the exact length of a biblical cubit. And going by the larger estimate, which was used for the Ark Encounter exhibit in the United States, the ark would have been 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 81 feet tall. If you go by the lower estimate, it was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. Now let us look at the Wyoming. What is the Wyoming, and what has it got to do with anything, you ask? Well, the Wyoming was an American wooden six-masted schooner. She was built in 1909 by the firm of Percy and Small in Bath, Maine. Now, professional professional shipbuilders, not a geriatric old man and his family using Bronze Age tools and probably having no knowledge whatever of shipbuilding. I doubt if they would have known the roundy ends from the pointy. Oh, well, then, of course, they weren't building a ship, whether they were building a big box. But anyway, never mind that. Now, the Wyoming had a length of 350 feet, the deck length, and she was the largest known confirmed wooden ship ever built. But due to her extreme length and her wooden construction, she flexed in heavy seas, causing her long planks to twist and buckle and warp, constantly allowing seawater to enter the hold. And her crew had to spend pretty much most of their time using pumps to keep her hold relatively free of water. In 1924, she encountered an unusually heavy sea, and she sank with the loss of all hands. Now, she is seen as having been at, or rather slightly beyond, really, the maximum length it is possible to build a wooden ship and keep it afloat, due to the way wood flexes and bends. And there is no way to prevent that, especially when it's aggravated by the weight of cargo, bending the timbers even more and opening gaps up between them. That is what wood does. It is the nature of wood. And as I say, there's nothing you can do about it. So the ARK was, depending on which cubit you go for, either 160 or 100 feet longer than the Wyoming, and loaded down with a huge number of animals and birds. And how many species of creatures are there in the world? Oh, well, never mind, we'll come to that. Plus all the tons of food and water for them. The ARK would have been monstrously heavy, and well, that would have added to the flexibility of her timbers, the sheer weight of her cargo alone causing them to bend and warp. You know, the waters of the flood would hardly have been smooth like a mill pond, especially to begin with. There would have been storms and big waves. The ARK would have leaked like a sieve. Her timbers would have warped. She would eventually have flooded, broken up, and sunk. It would not have been a matter of if, it would have been a matter of when she was going to go down. You know, remember, there were no pumps available back then to try to keep the water down, which, when you think of it, didn't save the Wyoming. And, you know, Noah's family running up and down the stairs with buckets, it doesn't really seem like that would have helped very much. Now, I saw a comment from someone saying that God designed the ARK, and therefore the design was good. Well, you know, it hardly matters who designed a craft that size and made it of wood, God or the Persian Small Company. It was still made of wood, and wood does what wood does, what God created it to do, you might say. That is what wood does. It bends, it warps. Unless, of course, God had somehow put a sort of magic spell on it that made it completely solid and rigid, like metal, so it wouldn't warp. But, you know, in that case, why have Noah spending decades building the thing? Why not just poof it into existence? There it is, ready to go. Bon voyage, Captain Noah. You know, that would seem to make sense. But there's more to the ARK story that doesn't really add up. Noah took 2 of every species of animal, bird, well, everything. All the creepy crawlies, basically anything that didn't make the maiden voyage of the good box ARK died in the flood. If it wasn't on the ARK, then it doesn't exist today, since its ancestors would have died in the flood. That is pretty obvious, since otherwise there was very little point in Noah taking the animals 2 by 2 into the ARK in the first place. It was to save them. So anything that didn't get into the ARK didn't get saved, therefore it's not here today. Now, there are 8.7 million species of animals and other creatures on our Earth. You know, roughly, give or take a few thousand either way. Thus, all of their ancestors made it to the ARK. Otherwise, well, they wouldn't be here. So 2 of each of them would mean the ARK had to accommodate 17.4 million creatures of various kinds. Plus, of course, a year's supply of the food and water for them. Now, since all those species still exist, they must have been saved from the flood, obviously. Well, saltwater fish, I suppose. Yeah, saltwater fish, they were all right. They didn't need the ARK. In fact, well, they had even more water to swim around in. They probably loved the flood. The ocean became so really roomy. But now the freshwater fish, well, they would have needed to be taken into the ARK, presumably in large water tanks. I don't ever remember having seen that mentioned. But freshwater fish, if the world flooded, with seawater, well, they were going belly up fairly fast. And all of that is in this 510 or 450 foot long barge, big box thing, or whatever you want to call it. It must have been a very crowded voyage. But since all those species survived the flood, they must have been on board. Had their ancestors missed the boat, they would not exist today. I think we can take that as a fact. That's just logic. Well, of course, the unicorns, obviously, well, they got there after they pulled up the gangplank, but all the rest of them seem to have made it. The dinosaurs, of course, well, they were already dead some 65 million years previously, despite what the ARK Encounter exhibition rather foolishly claims. The ARK's catering ability, oh no, that is something I really admire. The catering ability on the ARK was incredible. It really was. The vast quantity of food and fresh water required for all that lot, well, it was pretty much a miracle in itself. And the different types of food required for various animals, bamboo for the pandas, eucalyptus for the koalas, flies for the spiders, and so on. Well, come to think of it, I suppose, with all those animals, flies wouldn't have been too hard to find. 2 of each would have very quickly become a few thousand. Must have been quite a lot of rabbits, too, hopping around. Of course, how Noah was able to get all that livestock on board is rather hard to work out. And there's another thing, you see, about the creatures on the Ark. How did many of them get there? Did a couple of kangaroos make a raft and paddle from Australia around Africa through the Straits of Gibraltar to reach Mesopotamia? Did a pair of polar bears do the same? How did the animals of Asia and North and South America get there? And equally, one could ask, how did they get back after the flood? Well, now I mentioned that elsewhere, and I was told that it was very simple. Oh, silly me! Why didn't I think of it? I mean, I just wasn't thinking. Obviously, you see, I was told that there was only one landmass at that time. Subsequently, it separated into the continents we know today, and that was how the animals got to the Ark and got back home again afterwards. They walked. Yes. Well, that's partly true. Indeed, there was one great early landmass, Pangaea, and it did indeed separate into the 5 continents we know today. But you see, there was one tiny problem with that explanation. It's a load of what you might step in if you weren't careful walking around a cowshed. You see, Pangaea separated 200 million years ago, and that does seem to put the Ark story a tad far back in time. That was a good example of grasping at straws to explain the unexplainable without knowing anything very much about the straws. Next time, Google it. Now we come to another rather interesting point. Lots of animals on board the Ark. Kind of, obviously, that was the whole idea of the thing. Animals poo, and some of them do it rather frequently. Starlings, for example, do it about every 15 minutes. And, even today, just a few hundred large animals would require constant mucking out, as the farming phrase is. Even a few thousand of them, let alone millions, well, talk about poop mountain. Whew. There was no ventilation below decks on the Ark, and almost none topside either. It had one window and a door. Even if Noah's sons and their wives had spent all their waking hours running up and down with buckets of poo, chucking them overboard, the air on the Ark would have been unbreathable. But the craft would have been full of poisonous and extremely explosive gases: hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, nitrous oxide, and methane, all mixed together in a confined, unventilated space, just waiting for the tiniest spark to set them off. Going below, assuming, of course, they weren't overcome by the fumes before they even got down there, with an open flame like an oil lamp, no windows, remember, so they needed light, the Ark would have exploded. It would have been literally a floating combined gas chamber and bomb. I mean, that is simple, basic science. Here's another thing. Noah must have taken huge bags of grass seed and a great many saplings on board as well. In fact, saplings for every tree species on Earth that still exists, for that matter. The Earth was under a couple of miles of water for a year, according to the Bible. Even the highest mountains were submerged. So with no sunlight and the vast pressures at those depths, every form of plant life would be dead. When the waters receded, the Earth would have looked like the surface of Mars, only not as red. So, how was it all green and lovely again after they got off the Ark? How did the grass, the trees, the flowers suddenly grow back up again? Unless Noah had the seeds and the saplings to replant everything. And just how did he manage to do it? Or did God, of course, just restore all the plant life? No. If he did, well, why not have restored all animal life as well and saved Noah the trouble of lugging all those millions of animals around on the ark for a year? Further on that point, Noah sends out a dove to see if the waters have receded. Why he didn't just look out the window, I don't know, but he didn't. Anyway, and then the dove returns with an olive branch. Oh, wonderful, wonderful imagery. The dove and the olive branch, it's the symbol of peace. Lovely. But since all plant life was dead, everything had been underwater for all that time, where did the dove manage to find a living olive tree? Even if the water had been going down for a few weeks, an olive tree wasn't going to grow in that time, assuming a seed had remained viable for a year underwater. Of course, someone will say, oh, well, God grew it as a sign. Well, as I've already mentioned, then why didn't he just restore all the life, animals, plants, everything, and save all the ark trouble? The Ark story is, I'm afraid, scientifically, agriculturally, historically, and logically impossible, and provably so. But as I said, the ancient peoples loved allegorical stories, parables, riddles. They would wrap things up in mystical tales that gave a message not meant to be taken literally at face value. The Old Norse sagas are very much the same. Many of their stories, they were not meant to be taken as literal fact. They were allegorical. They represented ideas and values rather than actual, genuine events. The story of the Ark, indeed much of Genesis, can't be taken literally because it is simply scientifically impossible. If God made the laws of physics, which obviously he would have, well, then he would hardly break them himself. He's not going to break his own laws. The Bible has to be seen in the context of when it was written and who it was written by. Those people had no scientific knowledge as we do today. They knew only what they could see around them, and they interpreted it as best they could, without actually the knowledge to do so correctly. They had no idea what the sun actually was, or where it went at night. They didn't know what made a rainbow, nor the reasons for most other natural phenomena. They knew nothing of other lands that lay across the oceans. Simple things that we understand today were seen as omens and portents. But to treat many biblical stories with the same acceptance of actual fact that we would today with, something written by university-educated professors with computers and the sum of all human knowledge gathered over the centuries behind them, it just makes no sense. The people in those times did not have that knowledge. Many stories in the Bible, of course, are quite believable. They are entirely credible. Some can be proven by the historical or archaeological record, but others can't, and they are often scientifically or historically wrong. The same, of course, is true of other writings from the past, especially those before the so-called Age of Reason, when science began to replace superstition, and the idea that everything came from the workings of gods or spirits, and thus could not be questioned or challenged. Well, not at least if you didn't fancy attending a barbecue in the town square, when you were the barbecue. I hope you enjoyed this little look at a very large box, or whatever you want to call it. And till next time, I shall say goodbye for now.